In our last unit, we reflected on Paul VI's document, the Church in the Modern World, and particularly his principles of dialogue. Let me very quickly return to them and just run through them. Do you remember what he said? He said that just as God relates to us, so we must learn to relate to one another and to the world. He then looked at the characteristics of that dialogue, of that relationship. He said that the dialogue ought to be spontaneous, that it ought to be sincere, not manipulative, that a relationship should be unconditional, not based on merits or results. It should leave other people free to respond, and there is no pressure save the pressure of love, that it's to be open to all, that it's gradual, and finally that it is based on trust and friendship. Now, I'm sure all of us found that it was easy to agree with those principles. You know, we found ourselves saying yes quite easily. And yet, when we say yes to those principles, we're also saying yes to the way God relates to us, the way God dialogues with us. And of course, the fullest way that God dialogues with us is in the Word, or in the dialogue, or in Jesus himself. In other words, when we say yes to these principles, in reality, we're saying yes to Jesus. We're saying that for you or for me, Jesus is the cornerstone. He's the foundation of my life. I wonder, are we really, really aware and ready to make that kind of commitment? Because we're not simply talking about saying yes up here in the head, but saying yes in such a way that it affects, my whole being. It's asking us again, I suppose, to reflect on the distinction we talked about earlier, Cardinal Newman's, between notional and real assent. I'm making Jesus for me the answer to the world. And then I begin to try and integrate these principles into my own life, not merely in the mind, but into the very fibre of our being. Actually, another way of looking at it is to recognise that as Christians, when we say yes, we're committing ourselves to love. Because for Christians, love is our fundamental option. And yet, if you look at the way that word is used in our own times, we see a very different reality. Love is often portrayed as, something we turn on and off at whim. It's very often confused with, just fancying somebody, wanting somebody, bedding somebody. But Pope Paul says, love is much more. Love, he says, is God's love for us and that pattern of our love for each other. And he says it's all mapped out in those principles of dialogue. And as I said earlier, to say yes to them is in reality to commit ourselves to Christ, to commit ourselves to God, who is love. When we begin this process of love then, what we're beginning to do is, in fact, to enter into the process of living out these principles, living them out in our daily lives. When I attempt to live this life of dialogue, I spontaneously offer to somebody else the gift of my love. Obviously such an offer must come from deep within me. It's not a tap that you just turn on. It's got to flow out of our own deep personal commitment to love, to Christ. I'm sure we've all at some period experienced a kind of mechanical movement towards us, when somebody is really just, you feel you're just really part of somebody's schedule for helping. When you don't really feel that the person is coming to you because they love you, but they're doing it simply because they think it's the thing to do. It kind of leaves you empty, it leaves you hollow, it has no impact on you. And it has no impact. Why? Because, as I say, it doesn't create that environment of welcome, that environment of trust that allows us to say yes to the person and then to be able to move on. Because we know, as I say, that it hasn't come from the heart. I always remember, when we were working in the programme at home in Glasgow, we were talking to facilitators meeting one night, and we were talking about gathering groups together you know yourself, that's often the most difficult part, getting the group in that initial stage. And we're talking about the various ways it could be done, you know, talking from pulpits, posters, etc. And one of the boys said to me, John, can I suggest that maybe we ask somebody who we think would say no? And I thought, God, here we go again, you know, how do they make these distinctions? Would you like to tell me a wee bit more about it, Alan? He says, well, when our group was being formed, he says, everyone in our crowd, as it were, you know, were being asked, would you like to join Genesis? Are you going to give it a chance? He says, but you know, nobody asked me, even although one of the leaders was my own brother. And it suddenly dawned on me, he said, God, if all this crowd are going to be at Genesis every Sunday night, I've got no drink partner. So I said, you know, do you mind if I come? Aye, okay, they said, you know, they were hardly very welcoming, but sure if you want to. Okay, he says, I admit I hadn't been to church for 7 years. He says, but you know, they could have been a wee bit more welcoming, a wee bit more enthusiastic. I was very impressed. I thought, that's a good way of putting it. When the meeting finished, we were going away from the hall, and two of the lads, one of them was his brother, actually kind of pulled me back a wee bit and said, John, Alan's story's only, you know, it's nearly accurate. He's right, he said, we didn't ask him, because we knew that had we asked him, he'd have said no. So what we decided to do was just to constantly talk about it in his presence. And that way we hoped he would eventually say, yeah, that he'd eventually bite. I suppose that's what I mean when I say that, you know, a real environment is created when it comes out of love. You know, they created that situation for Alan in order, because they loved him, because it was important to him, but then allowed him to say yes. I know it's a slight distraction, but you know, Alan doesn't mind me telling this story, because during the programme, Alan actually came to terms with the fact that he was an alcoholic. And since then, he's now become one of the former speakers to young people in the west of Scotland in his work for AA. He's also very happily married. Married one of the girls in the group. And in fact, they now have their first baby who's ready for the toddlers version of the programme when we get there. When I attempt to live the life of dialogue, you know, you spontaneously offer the gift of love. I create an environment of love, inviting a response. And yet at the same time, I've left the other person free to respond or not to respond. Because one of the amazing things about dialogue, about relationships, is that, you know, we can't force them. And in fact, very often the person that we really want to have a relation with just doesn't respond. Sure, we've all experienced it. You know, in a very real sense, there's something very, very mysterious about relationships. I mean, why does one relationship develop and mature, and another, you know, just never really get off the ground? Why is it that very often it's the failed one is the one that we really had wanted to succeed? So, you know, when we enter into this process of dialogue, what we really are doing is entering into a process of revealing my love, of revealing myself, and taking the risk that the other person will respond and will affirm me in that relationship. And when in fact I do stretch out and it is affirmed, then my relationship can mature and can grow and can deepen. But it needs this affirmation.